In this video, I want to focus in on what I think is the most important part of a grant, constructing the project narrative, also called the project description. Much of my experience is with the USDA, so I use their terminology, but the concepts can be universally applied. From a technical perspective, the request for proposals or RFP can potentially include a lot of moving parts. In my experience, the bigger the grant or funding agency, the more moving parts are included. The most basic components of a grant proposal include the budget, the description of what you will do, and details about the personnel involved in the project. For more complicated grants, there's a lot more stuff. Thus, applying for a big grant can get overwhelming, especially if you've never done it before. The first-time applicant may also spend too much time on less significant items and less time on the more important ones. For example, in my experience, many first-time applicants spend a lot of time thinking about the money, that is, the budget. However, after spending many years writing my own grants, working with others to write theirs, sitting on review panels, and evaluating government funding for grants, I think the project narrative is the most important part. Context and perspective are important. For me, one thing I try to keep in mind in terms of grant writing is the audience reading the grant. So, the framework I present here keeps the person reviewing the grant in mind. Thus, it is vital to effectively communicate about the project in a way to which the reader can relate and connect. This means grant writers face two challenges. First, they must develop a clear picture of what it is they are trying to accomplish. Second, they must convey this picture in a way that works for the reader or reviewer. So what does this mean from a practical perspective? Well, you can think of a grant in two parts. First, there are all these necessary pieces. We can think of these as the technical parts. This list of requirements can include things like getting a DUNS number, constructing a budget, writing the project narrative and project summary, a logic model, etc. For a first-time applicant of a large grant, this can feel like an enormous amount of red tape. Second is effective communication of all, or at least many, of these parts, which goes into the project narrative. The most successful applications find the intersection of the technical parts and effective communication. Thinking about this intersection leads to what I consider the key concepts that directly or indirectly lead an applicant to success. These include good telling of a compelling story as to why the grant should be funded, effectively connecting all the different aspects of the project, developing goals and objectives that align with the funder's priorities, constructing tasks and a timeline that is realistic and feasible, establishing a logical strategy to accomplish project goals, establishing credibility by assembling an effective team of experts, and demonstrating accountability by identifying important project benchmarks. We will see these concepts over and over again in the framework. The framework I use employs a classic tool from journalism, the 6 W's or 5 W's and 1 H. I arranged the what at the center, but everything is connected. Also note that this is an iterative process, meaning that you will revisit the 6 W's multiple times. I start with the what in the context of the RFP. What do you think this references? Well, think goals and objectives. If you've done your homework, that is, carefully read the request for proposals, then you should have an idea about what the funding agency wants awardees to accomplish. This means you also need to understand what is important to the funding agency. Plus, you should have an idea of how well your interests and resources align or fit within the context of these priorities. So the what can be thought of as your list of goals and objectives, keeping in mind that goals are the broader outcomes, whereas the objectives are the specific actions or activities you will do to achieve the goals. The next is who. In the context of a grant, to whom do I refer by who? Well, think it takes a team, that is, your project team. As you think about the what, you also need to consider the who. In my experience, behind all winning project proposals is a team. One-person bands are not nearly as successful. This is especially true for large grants. Therefore, it is important to build a team that can effectively achieve the project goals. Here, you begin connecting some dots. One aspect of technical feasibility is having a person on your team who knows how to complete specific types of tasks. Additionally, be thinking about who will lead or be responsible for accomplishing specific objectives and the time commitment and costs. Thus, this is also a good place to begin thinking about the project budget. As a hint, sometimes partnering or contracting with other institutions, such as a university, can help fill expertise voids on particular aspects of a project. Next is why. Here, think storytelling. While you're thinking about the what and the who, take a step back and answer these questions. Why are you proposing what you are doing? More specifically, why is it important? Why does doing it matter? As you consider the why as it relates back to the what and the who, think about the story you are telling. What information and data do you have or can you find that supports your storytelling? Is it compelling? Can you make it compelling? This step will also help you think about potential groups or entities that may provide letters of support as you identify project stakeholders. Thinking about the why is also important in terms of connecting dots. First, in a general way, as it justifies the what and the who. Second, make sure it aligns to the agency priorities in a clear way. Next, we think about the how. This refers to the approach or strategy the project will implement to complete specific objectives and thus the broader goals. Returning back to the goals and objectives we identified in the what step, you will need to think about these in more detail. You should also be thinking about the who in terms of who will carry out specific tasks or activities. Consider other resources, such as equipment or supplies, you will need to provide to your experts to complete tasks. In addition to the what, this also pulls in aspects of the who, specifically their expertise. If you are proposing to do something, but you do not have the practical experience in doing it, it is possible the grant reviewer or evaluator may flag this. This may negatively impact your credibility and thus your feasibility. So, this means connecting more dots with the right team to do the how. It is also important that the how is laid out in a logical manner, again, impacting the proposal's credibility. Now for the when. When you think of when, think timeline. This includes the project life as identified in the RFP, as well as completing specific project benchmarks. Thus, the when is connected to the what and the how in terms of a date you will achieve different objectives, and the who as to which team member will be responsible for reaching specific benchmarks. Note that the when needs to be logical and feasible given the RFP deadlines. As a hint, for larger proposals over a multi-year period, a standard approach is to create a visualization of your timeline and benchmarks. Finally is the where. Many RFPs require applicants to identify specific locations where work will be carried out and project data and information stored. For example, this may include the locations of where research is conducted, in-person surveys are implemented, or sensitive data is housed. Thus, this step is connected to the what, who, how, and when of the project. The last bit of experience I want to share are a few tips. These are based on the reasons I have seen that led to a proposal's rejection. The most important tip I can give is to encourage applicants to develop an understanding of how and by whom your proposal gets evaluated. Next, and this one has been a heartbreaker, I have reviewed many projects based on great ideas, but the person proposing the thing clearly did not have the expertise to carry it out. Remember that most successful projects have a team of experts. Make sure to include your stakeholders in the process. That is, the people who will directly or indirectly benefit from the outcomes of your proposal. The most successful proposals do this part really well. Next, and another big one, make sure to weave the funding agency's priorities into the proposal and highlight these where they appear. This can be done in many ways and should be reflected by your stakeholder support letters and their participation in the project. Keep in mind, a winning grant proposal takes a lot of work, and for large grants, this means a lot more work. So it will be necessary to make multiple revisions as you reflect on the 6 W's. Finally, you may need to consider an evaluation plan. That is, a means to demonstrate you not only achieved the benchmarks, but ultimately the project goals.